were to take all of the professions that exist in the world and you were to sort of rank them as to which ones you thought would be the most likely to cause an international incident of some kind, I'm guessing that most people in the room would probably put moss scientist in the least likely category. Because when you think about that, it's just not the kind of a thing where you're like, what's going to foment revolt there, right? Probably just the word moss alone was enough for you to kind of go like, okay, this is least likely. And maybe, if you're conservative, you might have been like, okay, wait a second, he might say moss pirate or moss thief, and that could be a little more incendiary. But at the end of the day, when I say moss scientist, you're like, not going to happen. Right? But it turns out, historically speaking, this actually has happened one time, at least one time that we know of. And it was a guy named Melvin Oliver, and he worked for the United States Department of Agriculture, and he researched drought-resistant moss. And he came home at the end of the day one day, he ate his dinner, went to bed, and had that thing happen that probably a lot of you have had happen, like just when you're about to fall asleep, you get like this idea that's like a possible solution to a problem you've been thinking of, like in the back of your head. And the problem that he'd been thinking of was, scientists like me, we do this research on stuff, and we make genetically modified organisms, right? We make like new genomes for plants, and we make like new plants. But the problem with plants is that they are designed to reproduce. So when I sell this new plant to somebody else, they can just make as many as they want, and they don't have to pay me anymore for it, right? There's no way for me to protect my invention, essentially, and control it so that it only does what I want it to do. And so he was kind of thinking about this. He's like, I think I know how to fix that. And when he kind of drifted off to sleep, he was like, it's going to take a lot of work, but I think we might be able to do this. Now, obviously, that's kind of like an ideology, right? That's a way of thinking about intellectual property, and it's kind of familiar to our industry too, right? But in the same genre there, in the same agricultural genre, I just want to give you a totally polar opposite example. So it's 1988. You have to cast your mind back there if you were even alive. Old people like me, we were alive back then. But cast your mind back to 1988. And in Wisconsin, there's a farmer. His name is Wayne Peters. And he is a traditional family farmer, okay? And in the 1980s, of course, that was like the zenith in America, the apex, if you will, of sort of the factory farm, scientific-based farming, sort of like farming as a straight-up business kind of a movement, right? That was what was dominant at the time. And Wayne was just, a farmer. He lived on a farm and he worked on his farm, and he saw his way of life kind of disappearing around him. Because at the end of the day, it was becoming harder and harder for him to sell his products at a price where he could make a living and still do things the way that he had always done them, not using pesticides, not using herbicides, treating the animals well, letting them graze, all these sorts of things. And what bothered him most about what was happening in the outside industry, where everyone was focused on just maximizing crop yields and do whatever you have to do to make sure your cow produces the absolute maximum possible amount of milk, right? What bothered him most about that was that he actually really loved farming. And he knew that if people like him eventually went away entirely, when he retired, his children would not be able to enjoy that experience. If they wanted to be farmers like he was and do that work, which he found very rewarding, there would be no way for them to do it because it wasn't going to be about that anymore. And so what he did was he banded together with about 7 other people, and they formed something called the Cooley Region Organic Produce Pool, which, they're not marketers, they're farmers. So wasn't the best thing, but it acronyms to CROP, so you can give them credit for that. And what they decided to do was, maybe if we band together, we can start telling people like, hey, yeah, you have to pay a little more. They were dairy farmers, right? You have to pay a little bit more for this milk or this cheese, but it's coming from a family farm, and it's going to be something that's better. Like, you want this, you want to pay a little bit extra for this. But it turns out that that's actually really hard to do, because especially in an industry like farming, where things are very highly regulated, but in any industry really, when it's set up to do one particular thing and do it in a particular way, you run into all sorts of things. Problems with how do you get financing, problems how do you communicate with your customers, how do you even find the customers who are going to want these things. There's all these problems. And so it was extremely difficult for them to even get started, and they really could not figure it out. And so it seemed like this experiment was really not going to work, and Wayne Peters and everyone else's way of life really was going to disappear. Now, jump backwards a decade here, and this is in Austin, Texas, 1978. There's a couple, a guy by the name of John Mackey, and he and a woman named Renee Lawson were boyfriend and girlfriend at the time. And they were kind of, I don't want to pigeonhole anyone, but I'm just going to say, like, in knowing their history, I feel like they were kind of hippies. I'm just going to put it out there, they were hippies. Like, he lived in a vegetarian co-op for a while, but he wasn't even vegetarian. And so I'm just thinking, like, okay, he just liked that way of life. And so what they saw in Austin, Texas, and this is going to sound weird when I say it, but he lived in Austin, Texas, and when he looked around, there was nowhere to really buy foods that were sort of natural and were about, not having lots of processing and not having lots of chemicals in them. And so even though now we think of Austin as keep Austin weird, like the supermarkets there were all about the standard stuff that you would see, in 1978, it was just all processed foods. And he and Renee, they wanted to change that. They wanted to be able to go somewhere to a store, it was kind of like their dream, where like everything in the store would be like a natural food product, right? Everything there would be something that they wanted to eat. So they didn't have to worry about like, oh, where am I gonna go get this thing, or where am I gonna go get that thing? I could just go shop at this store and it's all the foods that I want, right? So they scraped together $45,000 from their friends and family, and they rented a storefront. And they, this convention center, there's like two supermarkets kind of on either side of it. The second closest one over there is a Safeway, right? And they used the name Safeway to pun on, to make the name of this storefront. It was called Safer Way, right? Because they kind of thought that it was bad to eat the other way. And so what they did is, when they started doing this with only $45,000, the storefront was extremely small because that's all they could afford to rent. And if your storefront is extremely small, there's nowhere to actually store all of your wholesale, like packaging, right, and your goods. So what ended up happening is they put it all in their house. Stuff would come in, and they rented this house, this is where they lived. They would just stack it up in the living room. So there were boxes in the living room. They'd overflow into, the kitchen, the bathroom probably. And this is, not exactly conforming to your typical residential lease. This is not typically something that they allow, and in fact, it's probably against some kind of Austin, Texas residential zoning law, I would imagine. So it was only a matter of time before this game was going to be up, and of course, the landlord finds out about this and is like, you guys are so evicted. And so just like that, in the middle of trying to make this store work, they find themselves homeless, right? So anyway, coincidentally, at this point in time, this is the late 70s. I'm really old at this point. I was actually playing my very first video game, like the first time I ever played a video game. It was like 79 or maybe 80. No one remembers, certainly not me, but I remember the experience certainly like it was yesterday. And the way that you had to play games back then, at least the kind that we had, was you had a terminal, which is not even exist anymore, right? And it's this big CRT display, like a television with a big old punch keys on it, and you would connect it to a mainframe over the phone line, and you would run a program on the mainframe, and it would, like one letter at a time, come back what was going to happen, right? And then you would type in what you wanted to do in like this game or whatever. Now, none of this was something I could ever manage on my own because I was 3, right? So there was like no way that I could figure this out. But I saw my dad using this because he used it for work, and I really, really wanted to be a part of it. I wanted to use this thing. And I don't know why, because my dad did other stuff, right? He, did woodworking and he loved playing baseball or whatever. But for some reason, there was like a magic to this device. And that was the thing that I really wanted him to like show me how to do. But, a 3-year-old can't do it. So, he was just like, okay, I'll run a game. And the games that they had up there were like text adventures, right? In fact, the particular one that I'm thinking of in my head is called Colossal Cave, which some of you may even have heard of. It's a famous text adventure, right? And what he would do is he would run that on the mainframe, and he would read out to me what came across on the screen, and then he would ask me what I wanted to do. And I'm sure he massaged my answers quite a bit because, as any of you who have ever played a text adventure know, their parsers are awful even when you're an adult, so a 3-year-old is not going to make any headway. But in one particular case, in that game, there is a dragon that you have to get by, and you say, kill dragon, and it asks you, what do you want to kill the dragon with? Your bare hands? Kind of facetiously. But to a 3-year-old, that's not facetious. It's just like, oh, that would be awesome to kill a dragon with your bare hands. Yes, do that. And my dad's like, okay, and he types that in, and it turns out that's the right thing to do in this game for some unknown reason. And I felt so great about that, because that's like the first time I ever did anything right in a video game. And I've pretty much been into them ever since. You know, I learned to program when I was 7. My dad taught me how to do it. And the first thing I wrote was a game. It was a thing where you could type in a number, and it would print out what happened as a result of that number. And I'm pretty sure that the review scores for this game would probably have been very low because it's the same every time you type number 1, you get the same result. So replay value, not good. But our one customer, which was my mom, she seemed to really like it. So I don't know who you're going to believe, right? But you know, I'm just saying, the fans, they know. That's my opinion anyway. All right, so anyway, Melvin Oliver goes to bed. He's got this idea. He's like, you know what? I think we can solve this problem of plants reproducing. We can solve this problem. We've got it. And so he starts doing research on the idea that he had, and he works with a company, because he's at the United States Department of Agriculture, so typically what they'll do is they'll work with an external company when they try to sort of do research projects, right? So they work with an external company called the Delta and Pine Land Company, and they work on developing this technology, and eventually it comes to fruition, and they get a patent on it, and they call it the TPS, Technology Protection System, I think is what they called it. And what this is it's you genetically modify a plant. Because remember, a plant has to germinate, right? Like when you grow a plant, it's got to make seeds at some point. That process is called germination. And so it's that thing that they wanted to stop, right? They want to stop the germination. And we could stop it in one plant easily. We just genetically modify that plant to not be able to germinate. But the problem is, once you do that, you can't reproduce the plant. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to make this plant make lots of seeds for you that you can sell. But when you give those seeds to someone else, you don't want them to be able to make more seed, right? And so what this system does is it puts into the plant's genome, like into its DNA, the ability for it to self-destruct its own germination, it self-sterilizes is the way you might put it, right? It's kind of an ugly way to put it, but that's what it is. And they make this self-sterilization capability masked by something else in the plant that it produces. And they make that masking contingent on some external chemical. So basically, at any time, they can just expose the seeds to that chemical, and it will turn off the masking, and the plant will become sterile. It'll self-sterilize, right? And so in this case, it happened to be tetracycline. So what you do is you take your seeds that you're going to sell, you bathe them in tetracycline, you send them off, and those seeds will never, again, germinate. They'll grow into plants, but they'll never make more plants, right? And so it sounds kind of sinister when I'm saying it, right? And the word self-sterilization does not sound good. It's not like a positive word that you would use at a party or something like this. And so at the end of the day, you might wonder, like, why didn't I hear more about this, or the Delta Pine and Land Company, or Delta and Pine Land Company? I don't even know. These don't sound familiar to me. You think I would have heard of this, right? And the reason that you've never heard of the Delta and Pine Land Company is actually because at this time, they were in the process of getting acquired by Monsanto, which pretty much everyone has probably heard of at this point, and they are not necessarily known for being the world's most friendly company. Okay, so what we know from Wayne Peters' little experiment here is that organic, family-farmed cheese and milk, it doesn't sell itself, unfortunately, right? Like, you can't just do it. The market doesn't just rejoice and welcome with open arms. And so these poor farmers back there who, honestly, like, I am rooting for them, right? Because anytime someone's big premise, the big goal they want to achieve in life is passing their way of life onto their children, I mean, it's a romantic and noble notion, right? You want them to succeed. But at the end of the day, they have to be able to actually sell this stuff in order to support their family farms. And so, as luck would have it, there's actually an organization called the National Farmers Organization. It's a nonprofit organization, kind of like the people who put together this conference. And it turns out that some of the members of this co-op, CROP, that Wayne Peters helped found were also members of that organization. And when that organization found out what they were trying to do, they said, you know what? And this organization is pretty powerful, actually. It goes back fairly far in American history. So they've got some skills, they get marketing a little bit better, and they know how economics works a little bit better than some dairy farmers from Wisconsin who really aren't adept at this. They're adept at farming. And so what they say is, you know what? What you really need is you just need someone to basically become the conduit for what you're doing. You produce the milk, we'll provide some funding, and we will connect you with people across the country who believe in the same sort of ideology. Because there's a movement going on right now. It's like organic foods movement, which at the time, that wasn't even a defined thing, right, in the late 80s. It was really amorphous, and it hadn't kind of gotten into the mainstream. But they're like, there's this movement, and it's starting to gain traction. I think this could really work. And it turns out they were right. Once they just had that little bit of, of wind in their sails, if you will, and they had people who could do some of the things that they need to do, like communicate to their customers what it was that they were selling, finding people with a similar ideology who believe in family farms and getting them connected, just that much allowed them to start succeeding. And unlike before, it looked like this was actually going to take off. Now that was a really, it was a stroke of very good luck, you might say, right? And the thing about the couple in Austin, Texas, John Mackey and Renee Lawson, they kind of had the opposite of this. I mean, they were homeless already, right? They got kicked out of their house. And at this point, all they had was a storefront. So, what do you do? And I don't know what you would do in this situation, but like, declare bankruptcy, go try to get a job and buy an apartment or something like that. I don't know, right? But they believed so strongly in this idea of a natural food market. They were like, you know what? We've been working so hard to make this succeed, and this is what we believe in, and we're at the store all the time anyway. Let's just sleep in the store, right? And now that sounds totally ridiculous to me because I'm like, if you just moved out of a situation where you got in trouble for using a residential space for commercial purposes, you are now moving into a commercial space to use for residential purposes. Like, this is ridiculous. Like, don't you learn your lesson? And, I guess they didn't learn their lesson, so they went ahead and did that. And I mean, they literally lived in this store, right down to the fact that when they showered in a Hobart industrial dishwasher. And they used the little hot water hose disconnected to that's how they showered. And that is, you can take that as a sign of how much they believed in this concept. They were willing to do that. Or you can just say, well, Casey, that's kind of like what hippies do. Like, I'm not that impressed, shower in a Hobart. It kind of sounds luxurious, actually. I mean, have you seen how they camp? And I don't know. I don't know about that. I don't go camping. It's not my thing. But point being, they really wanted to make this work, and so they made that decision. And it turned out to be a pretty good decision because the store keeps going. They start making money on it. It gets bigger and bigger. Their customer base grows. And 2 years after that, they are in a position to merge with one of the other natural grocery stores in the area to open a 10,000 square foot natural market, which was really big at the time. That's almost the size of a regular supermarket, right? This is crazy. But unfortunately, like I said, these people have incredibly bad luck. And so one night, Renee is managing the store and the employees. John is taking a break. He's playing board games with some friends. She calls up and she's like, we're in the middle of a rainstorm right now. And the creek near the place is kind of, the water level is rising and I'm worried, right? Next call, okay, the creek is overflowing. Next call, okay, the water is at the door of the store. What do we do? And they're like, I don't know what we do. Plug the door, try to make it not go through. Anyway, it turns out they were caught in one of the worst storms the worst floods that Austin, Texas has ever had. It was a Memorial Day flood. And by the time the employees evacuated with Renee, the water was up to their waists. It destroyed all the inventory in the store, and it ruined most of their equipment. And, grocery stores don't operate, especially a small natural grocery store with, no other locations. They don't have a lot of cushion there, right? So this is devastating. It's unclear how you come back from this. So, all right. I promised you an international incident at the beginning of the talk, and I don't want to fail to deliver that. So the Delta and Pine Land Company is acquired by Monsanto. And if nobody was really going to care very much about this technology protection system that the Delta and Pine Land Company was doing, as soon as you attach the name Monsanto to it and people find out what it's actually supposed to do, that becomes newsworthy. And so slowly, all of these organizations who are already not particular fans of Monsanto, but who are farmers advocates, who are advocates for farmers around the world, they are like, this sounds awful. If Monsanto can start to control seed in this way and sell it to other seed companies who will control seed in this way, they will basically become a monopoly on like what people can plant in some countries. Some countries get a lot of their seed this way, and they could just go in and force farmers to do whatever they wanted, because there's no way to even break the law and replant seed, because there'd be no seed to plant, right? And so it becomes sort of a natural, it's like an international, it's an international incident. There's a lot of furor. What ends up happening is the UN has a subcommittee on biodiversity. They have a sub-conference on this. They come out against it. The head of the Rockefeller organization gives a speech to Monsanto's own board telling them, you must not commercialize this. And strangely enough, Monsanto actually listens. It's so overwhelming that Monsanto actually listens. So if you think about this, it's kind of crazy, actually, because the food industry, I mean, that doesn't really operate like our industry in that sense, right? You know, when things happen like this, there aren't all of these authors. You know, the food industry has all these authors who are writing books about what food means and how food should be, you know, what our food supply should look like. There's all these organizations that think about that and advocate on behalf of people, all this sort of stuff. So in this case, the Technology Protection System, which got rebranded the Terminator Gene by the people who do PR for these organizations who wanted to stop it from happening, right? They were able to basically shut this down before it ever even got out in the wild. And that's kind of incredible to me anyway, how much they were able to do here. And it's very important for emerging markets and that sort of stuff, but what I thought about when I considered how this whole thing went down was that actually, in America, there was a lot more defense in depth for this. Meaning, even if they hadn't been able to convince Monsanto not to do this, at our current state of how agriculture works, we could actually have avoided any serious problems. Because there's a big organic foods movement, there's a big thing, all this stuff, because of the people that I've been talking about in this lecture, right? Those Wisconsin farmers, what happened is Monsanto, who features prominently in this lecture multiple times, introduced a thing called recombinant bovine growth hormone in the 1990s. And consumers hated this concept. It had terribly bad press. Nobody wanted it. And so people started asking for milk that didn't have it. And guess who was there to give them that? Crop. The co-op and others like it across the country who were still doing family farming, who would never have done that to their animals, they were in a position to capitalize on that. And they grew extremely quickly. And in fact, you have heard of them. This is their trade name, Organic Valley. They're in basically every supermarket now. You can get this anywhere. And so the little Cooley Region Organic Produce Pool, and in fact, I think CROP is still their acronym for their legal name, but this is their trade brand now, right? Is one of the most desired brands in the country, and it demands sometimes twice the price of a competing product that does not feature organic family farming, right? And of course, you know, where did I get this guy right here? Well, let me put him aside for a second and just say, so it turns out actually, you know, if you take a look at the Safeway or something like this, if that thing got flooded, it's probably not very likely that anyone would care. That's the corporate, it's the, you know, I don't know, it's some corporation that runs a supermarket, they'll take care of it, insurance, whatever. But it turns out if you're a natural food store, and you're one of the very first natural food store, and all of the people who are customers at your store believe in what you're doing and care about what you are doing, when you have a flood that wipes out everything in your store and destroys all your equipment, everyone wants to help you. And so John Mackey and Renee Lawson, when the store got flooded, their customers came down to help them rebuild it. The people who sold them their products allowed them not to pay for a few months so they could get back on their feet. And it turned out that step by step, after having rebuilt that store, they opened another one, and it continued to grow and grow and grow. And it became the chain where I bought this milk, the actual first closest store to this convention center, right on the other side of the highway, which is Whole Foods. another premium brand, one that is so desired that people even have a nickname for it, Whole Paycheck, because they believe it's so expensive, but they shop there in droves. So nobody's under any illusions about what they're getting when they go to Whole Foods, but because it ideologically matches with what they want out of the world and what they believe their food should be, they will pay extra, and they will support it, right? And so I think about this, and I am in total awe of the food industry, and those, I mean, because they were little guys, right? And you look, and there's tons of examples of this. Like I said, I couldn't even fit this lecture into 30 minutes, so I couldn't go into a lot of them, but I'm just in awe of how much they care about what they're doing and how they organize to make sure it will happen. And I see all kinds of parallels between their industry and our industry, right? Because at the end of the day, we definitely do have a split in the game industry. We even have names for it, AAA and indie, right? We have giant farming that is metrics oriented, that is about maximizing profits and making games as a business. And then we have independent developers who really love games and just want that authorial control and want to do it the way it's always been done. I want to make a game that I want to play, and I believe that customers will want that from me, right? And what's so fantastic about the game industry right now is that without even having ever had to really fight for this yet, both of these things coexist peacefully. AAA developers don't care about what indie developers do. They don't think that we'd be stealing their markets. Indie developers don't care what AAA developers do. It's something for everyone, right? And no matter what it is that you believe in, this market supports you. And I think that is absolutely incredible, right? What I don't think is so incredible is the fact that this is extremely, extremely tenuous. Because at the end of the day, in order to ship a game to anyone, they must have hardware on which to play it. And over the past decade, what we have seen with game hardware is that it's becoming increasingly closed even in the personal computing space. And what that means is that a very, very small number of companies, Microsoft, Apple, Sony, Nintendo, very, very few, completely control whether you will be able to connect with your customers, how you will be able to connect with your customers, whether they can get your product at all. And in my mind, that looks a lot like what Monsanto wants to do, right? They want to control what's going on their platforms. It's not necessarily that they're going to be nefarious, it's that they want that control. And when they have that control, what they're going to do with it and what they have done with it, you can look at what they have done traditionally when they've had these controls, is they will do what benefits them most for their business. That's not so concerning when you're a AAA developer, because when you're a AAA developer, you have some negotiating power and people need you on their platform, right? If I make Call of Duty, Microsoft has to deal with me. It's not going to be very easy for them to sell another Xbox if they don't have that product. But my game, Handmade Hero, if I went to Microsoft and said, you know what, we need you to do this stuff or we're not putting Handmade Hero on your platform, they would turn to me and say, what is Handmade Hero, right? And that would be the end of that discussion if the discussion even happened at all. And so I think we need to start doing real work to keep what we have gotten by accident that is extremely valuable. Because the equivalent of the Terminator Gene is actually all around you. Many people in this room probably have an iOS device. Nobody can make anything on an iOS device unless they go through Apple. You have to pay $99 to Apple to even program something for your own iOS device. This laptop that I'm running the presentation on comes with something called a TPM, a Trusted Platform Module. One letter away from the acronym of the Technology Protection System. Isn't that amusing? And what that chip is designed to do is to make it so that not just anyone can write code for this machine. Only people with the signing keys can make stuff for this machine. And Microsoft hasn't decided to turn this on everywhere yet, but maybe someday they will. And so I think now, because I know from reading the history what the lead time is on building defenses for these sorts of things, I think now is the time for us to figure out how to start. And I think we can take a lot of lessons from the food industry because there's two big things that we as game developers can do. There's things that authors need to do, there's things that organizations need to do, but we are game developers, what can we do? The first one is to start establishing the concept of an organic brand. And I don't know exactly what the name needs to be for that, but the concept that we communicate to the consumer that there are indies, they are valuable, they believe in a way of life, they're making games because they love them. And people know this, it's out there. But it doesn't have a stamp. It's a big difference when you talk about an ideology and when you've got a stamp, organic, it means something. And people know they can shop for it and feel good that they are supporting a particular way of life, right? And the other thing is we desperately, desperately need a Whole Foods. We need somebody to start making hardware or committing to making their hardware the place that will always be open and that will not try to curate the content. It will not try to stop developers from developing on their own machines or selling over their website or distributing it to their fans, that will allow that open ecosystem to continue. And that is definitely the hardest one. And like I said, if we want that to happen, we have to start pushing for it now. So I'd just like to end by saying the person, of course, in the story who I identified the most with was Wayne Peters, because when I think about his situation, I get kind of teary-eyed when I think about the concept that all someone wants to do is they've loved farming their whole life and they just want to pass it on to their kids. And honestly, I've loved game development my whole life, and I feel exactly the same way. And it would absolutely break my heart to know that when I am gone, the next generation of programmers, of game developers, will not be able to choose the kind of life that I did, simply because we let the Monsantos of our industry take that away from them. Thank you very much.
I know we're a couple of minutes over. Chris and Tyler, you're in the room? Okay, come on up.